She did not hear it coming. That was the thing about moments that break your life in two. They do not announce themselves. They do not give you time to prepare your face or straighten your spine, or decide ahead of time that you will not cry. They simply arrive. And then everything you thought you were is lying on the floor around your feet like shattered glass. And you are standing in the middle of it, wondering how something that beautiful could cut so deeply. Nora Vance heard the laughter first. She always heard the laughter first. It started near the stone archway that separated the castle kitchens from the great corridor, a bright and vicious sound that belonged entirely to Saraphene Voss. The kind of laughter that was never just laughter, but always also a weapon, a declaration, a reminder of exactly where every person in the room stood in relation to her. Nora had her back turned, her hands deep in a basin of cold water, scrubbing the residue from the ceremonial pots that had been used to prepare the feast for the nobles who had arrived that morning from the northern territories. Her knuckles were red. They were always red. She had stopped noticing a long time ago. "Is that the Vance girl?" Saraphene's voice carried the way voices do when they are not trying to be quiet. When quietness is not the point. When being heard is the entire purpose of speaking. I always forget she works here. She blends in so perfectly with the walls. The two women with Saraphene laughed. The way women laugh when they are afraid not to. The kind of agreement that is also surrender. Nora did not turn around. She had learned, over years of this precise experience, that turning around was exactly what was wanted. It gave them a face to aim at. It confirmed that the words had landed. It transformed cruelty into conversation, and Saraphene was far better at conversation than Nora had ever managed to be. "I heard she still has not shifted," one of the women said, her voice lower but not low enough. Nothing in that corridor was ever low enough to be private. 23 years old and no wolf. Can you imagine? "I can imagine," Saraphene said, and her voice had dropped into something that was almost sympathetic, the most dangerous register she owned. "Living in your father's shadow when you have none of his gifts. Aldrich Vance was the greatest warrior this clan has ever produced. And then there is her." Nora's hands went still in the water. The cold had moved past her. Fingers now and settled somewhere behind her sternum. A familiar weight she carried without examining too closely. She breathed once, then twice, then heard the sound of their footsteps continuing down the corridor and eventually disappearing. And only then did she let the breath out all the way. Marin, who was 70 years old and had worked in the castle kitchen since before Nora was born, appeared at her elbow with a fresh cloth and said nothing at all. She simply set the cloth on the edge of the basin and went back to her own work. That was how kindness operated in the lower levels of Ashvale Castle. It did not announce itself. It did not draw attention to the wound. It simply appeared next to you and let you decide what to do with it. "Thank you," Nora said quietly. "The ceremonial bowls need to be ready before the third bell," Marin replied, which was the closest thing to "you are going to be fine" that the old woman had ever offered anyone, and which Nora understood completely. The great ceremony of binding happened once every generation. That was the part that Nora had been told, the official part, the version written in the histories that the children of the clan were made to memorize before their first shift. The vow creature, the ancient entity called the bond that had been tied to the Blackthorn bloodline since before the founding of the 7 clans, would emerge from the sacred chamber beneath the castle and choose. It always chose. In the earliest records, it had chosen the mate of the Alpha himself, a declaration more binding than any political contract, more permanent than any law, more unassailable than any alliance. But it had been 3 generations since the bond had done more than appear briefly and retreat, as though whatever it had been looking for had not yet arrived. Most people in the clan privately suspected it had gone dormant. Most of the scholars who served in the castle library had papers arguing that the entity had faded beyond the capacity for true choice. The ceremony was still held because tradition was tradition, and because the Alpha King Caden Blackthorn understood better than anyone that appearances were their own kind of power. What the histories did not say, what Nora had not been told, and had no way of knowing as she scrubbed ceremonial pots in cold water and listened to the sound of laughter echoing down stone corridors, was that the bond had not gone dormant at all. It had simply been waiting. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The third bell rang while Nora was still in the kitchens, and she listened to it the way she listened to most things that happened in the upper levels of the castle, from a distance, through stone walls and the muffled weight of hierarchy. She had no reason to be present at the ceremony. The kitchen staff did not attend the ceremony. They prepared for the feast that would follow it, regardless of what the ceremony produced, because feasts were required whether the bond chose or did not choose, whether something remarkable happened, or whether the ancient creature appeared for 30 seconds and then withdrew, as it had for the past 60 years. Nora's role was the feast. Her role was always the feast, or the preparation for it, or the cleaning after it. Her role was everything that made the visible world possible, while remaining invisible herself. She was carrying a stack of copper serving dishes toward the warming shelves when she heard the sound. It was not a sound she had a word for. It was not like the horn that announced the beginning of ceremonies, and it was not like the drums that marked the rhythms of ritual, and it was not like any of the musical instruments that the clan's musicians played during formal occasions. It was older than any of those things. It moved through the stone walls of the castle the way a heartbeat moves through a body, felt. More than heard, present everywhere at once, impossible to locate and impossible to ignore. Nora stopped walking. The copper dishes in her arms seemed to grow heavy, or perhaps she simply became aware of their weight in a way she had not been a moment before. The sound moved through her chest and found something there, something that had been still for 23 years, and pressed against it, gently, the way you press your palm against a door to test whether it is locked. "What is that?" said one of the younger kitchen workers, a boy of perhaps 16, who had only been with the castle staff for a few months and had therefore never heard it before. "The bond," Marin said, and her voice was different, stripped of its usual practicality, quieter in a way that was not diminishment, but reverence. "It is moving." "It never moves," someone else said. "It is moving now," Marin replied. Nora set the copper dishes down on the nearest surface because her arms had started to shake, not with fear. She did not think it was fear, but with something she could not name. A vibration that started in her palms and moved upward through her forearms and settled in her shoulders like a held note. The sound grew. It was not louder exactly. It was more present. It was filling the spaces between sounds the way water fills the spaces between stones, not displacing anything, simply occupying every available gap until there was no gap left that did not contain it. And then it stopped. And the silence that followed was the loudest thing Nora had ever heard. Above her, through the ceiling, through the floors that separated the kitchens from the great ceremonial hall, she heard a different sound. Human voices, hundreds of them. And then, cutting through all of it, a single note of something that was not a voice but was not silence either, a resonance that she felt in the bones of her jaw and the roots of her teeth. And that was moving, she realized. It was moving, and it was moving. Downward, toward her. She was not aware of stepping backward until her shoulders met the wall. The kitchen had gone entirely still. Marin was standing with both hands pressed flat against the work table, her head slightly bowed, her eyes closed. The young boy had gone pale and was pressed into the corner near the bread ovens. The other workers had arranged themselves instinctively against the walls, leaving the center of the kitchen floor open, a clearing no one had consciously decided to create, but that everyone had somehow understood was necessary. The door to the kitchen opened. Not the door that led from the corridor, the one that servants used to pass in and out. The other door, the one at the far end of the kitchen that Nora had always assumed led to a storage room and had never seen opened in the 3 years she had worked in this castle. That door opened, and the light that came through it was not the yellow light of torches or the pale light of windows. It was silver. It moved. The way water moves, shifting and finding its own level, and it was accompanied by the sound, closer now, so close that Nora could feel it reshaping the air in her lungs. And through the door came the bond. She had seen illustrations of it in the clan histories. Every child in Ashvale had seen those illustrations, but illustrations, she understood now, were as useful for preparing you for this moment as a drawing of the ocean was for preparing you to drown. The creature was large, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, larger than the war wolves that the Blackthorn Guard kept in the kennels for battle, and it moved with a slowness that was not slowness but deliberateness, each step placed with a precision that suggested it had never in its existence taken an unnecessary action. Its coat was silver and white, and something beyond both, a color that did not have a name in any language she knew. Its eyes were not the eyes of an animal. They were not the eyes of a person. They were the eyes of something that had been old, when the first stone of the first pack settlement had been laid, and that had been waiting, for all of that time, for exactly this moment. It crossed the kitchen floor without looking at any of the people pressed against the walls. Marin did not raise her head. The boy in the corner had stopped breathing, or so it seemed to Nora in the breathless haze of that moment. The creature walked through the clearing in the center of the room as though the clearing had been made for it, which of course it had been, because some part of every person in that room had known, without knowing how they knew, that the center needed to be clear. It stopped in front of Nora. It was so close that she could see the individual filaments of its coat, each one carrying that nameless light. It was so close that she could feel the warmth that came from it, not the warmth of a body, but something older, something that felt like the warmth of a fire that had been burning since before her birth, and would continue burning after everything she knew had turned to ash. Its eyes, those impossible eyes, were level with hers, and they were looking at her with an expression she had no framework for understanding, because the expression was not what she would have called recognition. It was something prior to recognition. It was the expression of something that had always known she was here, and had simply, finally, arrived. The bond lowered itself to the floor in front of her. Feet. It pressed its head to the stone, and in the upper hall, through the ceiling, through the floors, she heard 300 people go completely silent. She did not know how long she stood there. The cold water on her hands had dried. At some point she had pressed both palms flat against the stone wall behind her. The creature's light pulsed, slow and steady, the rhythm of something patient and ancient and entirely certain of what it was doing. And then gradually, it raised its head and looked at her once more, and she had the sensation, impossible to explain and impossible to doubt, that something inside her chest had shifted. Some lock had turned. Some door had been opened that she had not known was there. That she had perhaps been told, all her life, did not exist. Nora. The voice came from behind the creature, from the direction of the silver-lit door that still stood open. A voice she recognized from 3 years of existing in the periphery of his presence, from every formal address she had heard drifting down from the upper floors, from the one time she had seen him up close, 2 years ago, when he had come through the lower corridor with his guard, and she had pressed herself against the wall, and he had not looked at her at all. Alpha King Caden Blackthorn was standing in the doorway, and his expression was one she had never seen on him before, which was remarkable because she had studied his expressions the way one studies the weather when one's survival depends on reading it accurately. He was not calm. He was not commanding. He was standing in a doorway in the kitchen of his own castle, watching an ancient sacred entity bow at the feet of a girl who scrubbed pots, and he looked, for the first time in her experience of him, like a man who did not know what was going to happen next. "You need to come with me," he said. "What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below." It took Nora a moment to understand that he was speaking to her. Not because she was slow, but because people in his position did not speak to people in hers. The social architecture of Ashvale clan was not subtle about this. The Alpha King communicated through his council, through his guards, through his household managers, through the elaborate network of intermediaries that existed precisely so that the distance between his world and hers never needed to be crossed. And yet, he was standing in a kitchen doorway, and the bond was still at her feet, and 300 people were silent above them, and there was nowhere for the moment to go except through me, she said. It was not her finest conversational contribution, but it was honest. "You," he said. Something moved across his face, something she could not read, something that was not impatience and was not amusement, but contained elements of both. "We need to move. Now." "I do not understand what is happening," she said, and she was aware, distantly, of how inadequate that sentence was to describe the totality of her current experience. But it was also simply true. "Neither do I," Caden Blackthorne said, and that was the thing that made her step away from the wall. Not the urgency in his voice, not the presence of the ancient creature still radiating its silver light at her feet. The honesty. An Alpha King admitting, in front of witnesses, that he did not understand something. That was not a thing that happened. And yet it had happened. And she found herself moving. The bond rose as she moved, and fell into step beside her, and she felt the warmth of it along her left side like a second heartbeat. And she walked through the silver-lit door with the Alpha King of Ashvale clan, and the last thing she heard as the door closed behind her was Marin's voice, very quiet, saying something that might have been, finally, or might have been something else entirely. The passage beyond the door was not the storage room she had imagined for 3 years. It was a corridor carved from stone much older than the castle, the walls smooth in the way that stone becomes smooth when it has been touched by hands for generations beyond counting. The light from the bond moved with them, illuminating the passage in that shifting silver glow, and Caden walked slightly ahead of her with the posture of a man who was accustomed to knowing where he was going, and was not entirely certain, tonight, that he did. She watched the set of his shoulders. She had spent years watching people from positions of invisibility, which meant she had developed an involuntary accuracy about small physical signals that most people in rooms full of power never needed to develop. His shoulders were held deliberately. That was tension managed, rather than tension absent. "Where are we going?" she asked. "The sacred chamber," he said, "where the ceremony was held. The council is still there. The guests are still there." He paused. "Your appearance is going to require some explanation." "My appearance," she repeated. She was still processing the fact that she was in a private passage with the Alpha King and an ancient supernatural entity, none of which fell within the normal parameters of her Thursday evening. "You mean the bond's choice of me?" "Yes. And you need to explain it to the council, and the guests, and my betrothed." The last 2 words came out flat, not with the flatness of indifference, but with the flatness of a man who was choosing, very carefully, not to allow his voice to carry any information it was not required to carry. She heard it anyway. She had been hearing the things people did not say for most of her life. "Saraphene Voss," Nora said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The bond sat between them, patient and luminous. When he turned to look at her, the silver light caught the planes of his face, and she was struck, not for the first time in her years of peripheral observation, by the particular quality of his attention. When Caden Blackthorne looked at something, he actually looked at it. He did not perform looking. He did not manage the appearance of focus while his thoughts were somewhere else. He was, in this moment, looking at her in a way that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand something. "You know who she is," he said. "Everyone who works in this castle knows who she is," Nora said. And then, because it was true and because truth had always felt more sustainable to her than careful phrasing, she added, "She is very good at being known." Something changed in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something that might have become a smile under different circumstances, in a different corridor, under a different quality of light. "She is," he agreed. And then, "She is not going to take this quietly. I did not expect she would." He studied her for another moment. "You are remarkably calm for someone whose entire life just changed." Nora considered that. The trembling in her arms had stopped. The sensation in her chest, that shifted lock, that opened door, was still there. But it had settled into something that felt less like disruption and more like arrival. Like the feeling of coming in from cold air. Like the feeling of setting down something heavy you had been carrying so long you had forgotten you were carrying it. "I do not think it has fully arrived yet," she said. "The knowing of it. I think I am still in the part where I am doing what needs to be done, and the understanding will come later." He looked at her for one more moment, and then he nodded, once, and turned back toward the corridor. "Then let us go do what needs to be done," he said. The sacred chamber was everything the stories said it was. Nora had never been inside it. She had never expected to be inside it. It was carved from the same ancient stone as the passage. But here the stone had been worked with a precision and artistry that no living craftsman could replicate. Every surface, covered in the interlocking patterns of pack history, the shapes of wolves and moons and running water and blooming silver flowers that were the sigil of the Blackthorn line. The ceiling was high enough that torchlight could not reach it. The floor was worn smooth by the feet of generations, and in the center of the chamber, arranged in the semicircle that the ceremony required, were 300 people who had been present for the most significant supernatural event in 60 years. They went, quiet when she entered. The ones nearest the door noticed first, and the quiet spread outward through the crowd, the way silence spreads through a forest when something unfamiliar moves through it. Creature by creature, until the whole wood is still. Nora kept her eyes forward. She had learned that from years of walking through rooms where she was unwanted. You kept your eyes forward, and you kept your feet moving, and you did not look at the expressions, because the expressions were not information you needed to carry through the rest of the day. But she heard Saraphene's intake of breath. She heard it because Saraphene was standing at the center of the semicircle, in the position that had been intended for her, the position from which she had presumably expected to receive the bond's acknowledgement, and the sound she made when she saw Nora enter behind Caden with the ancient creature moving at her side was not the sound of someone prepared to be gracious. "What is this?" Saraphene said. It was not a question. It had the shape of a question, but it was actually a refusal, the grammatical form of a person declining to accept the reality being presented to them. "You know what it is," said the eldest member of the council, a woman named Torvin, who had white hair and a face that had absorbed a lifetime of difficult truths without being broken by any of them. "You were here. You saw it. We all saw it. What I saw," Saraphene said, and her voice was controlled in the E. Way that very expensive things are controlled, with great underlying effort, made invisible by practice, was a kitchen servant somehow interfering with a sacred ceremony. "The bond is not interfered with," Torvin said. "That is its defining characteristic." "There are precedents for corruption," Saraphene said. "There are cases in the records of outside influence affecting a vow creature's judgment. I want the historians called. I want this examined before anyone draws conclusions. You are "Welcome to Call the Historians," Caden said from beside Nora, and his voice was the voice he used in formal settings. She recognized it from its particular quality of absolute authority made to sound effortless. "They will tell you what Torvin just told you. They will tell you what every scholar in the 7 clans would tell you. The bond is not corrupted. The bond does not err. That is what the bond is." "She is a servant," Saraphene said, and the control in her voice slipped, just slightly, just at the edges. "She does not even have a wolf. She has never shifted. She is not ranked. She is not noble. She is not anything." The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence than the one that had preceded it. It was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a room full of people watching something that they would remember for the rest of their lives, each of them quietly positioning themselves in relation to it, each of them making the calculations that power makes necessary. Nora felt the bond move. It moved from her side to the center of the chamber, and as it moved, the torchlight changed. Not went out. Changed. It became something richer, something that carried more colors than firelight normally carries, and the ancient creature stood in the center of that changed light and looked at Saraphene Voss with those impossible eyes, and Saraphene, for the first time in Nora's experience, went completely still. And then something happened inside Nora that she had no preparation for and no warning of. The door that had been opened in the kitchen corridor, the thing in her chest that had shifted, it did not just continue to open. It broke open. It was not painful. It was the opposite of painful. It was the way a held breath releases, but the breath had been held for 23 years, and the release was proportional to the holding, vast and complete, and full of a light that she felt from the inside before she saw it happening on the outside. Because it was happening on the outside. She could see it on the faces of the people nearest her. She could see it in the way Caden turned toward her, quickly, his expression stripped of its formal composure for the second time in an hour, showing something raw and unguarded and uncertain in the most human way. She could feel it in her hands, in her feet, in the back of her throat, in the roots of her hair. She could feel it in the place in her chest, where something was waking up that had been asleep for as long as she could remember. Something that was not just her own heartbeat, but a second one, or a larger one, or the original one that her own heartbeat had always been an echo of. "That is not possible," said someone in the crowd. She did not know who. It did not matter. "It is not just possible," Torvin said, and her voice was very quiet now, so quiet that the room leaned in to hear it. "It was always inevitable. We simply did not know to expect it." The silver light that came from Nora Vance was not the same silver as the light of the bond. It was her own, specific to her, carrying something that was half the white of winter moonlight and half the gold of something older, something that moved in the patterns of the sigils carved into the chamber walls, as though those patterns had been made with her in mind, which, she was beginning to understand, they had been. She could feel the wolf. For the first time in 23 years, she could feel the wolf. Not the absence of it, which was all she had ever known, but the presence, the warm and ancient and entirely certain presence of an animal that had been patient longer than she had, that had been waiting for exactly this moment, this chamber, this recognition, this opening. It pressed against the inside of her skin with the gentleness of something that has been waiting a very long time and is in no hurry now that the wait is over. "What bloodline?" Caden said, and he was addressing Torvin, but his eyes were on Nora, and his voice carried the specific quality of a man who has just found the answer to a question he did not know he had been asking. "What bloodline carries both silver and gold?" Torvin was quiet for a long moment. The chamber was completely still. The bond had returned to Nora's side and was radiating that patient warmth. Saraphene had not moved from her position at the center of the semicircle. but something in the way she was holding herself had changed from the rigid control of offense to something more like the rigid control of fear. And Nora noted the distinction without examining it closely. "There is only one bloodline," Torvin said at last, "that carries both. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on." "The founding bloodline," said one of the older council members, an enormous man named Breswick, who had the voice of someone accustomed to making himself heard in large outdoor spaces and had never fully adjusted his volume for indoor settings. He was looking at Nora with an expression of complete astonishment. The bloodline of the first Alpha Queen, the line that was thought to have ended 4 generations ago. "It did not end," Torvin said. "It was hidden." "Hidden by whom?" Caden said. "By the man who understood that his daughter's life would be worth nothing if certain parties knew what blood she carried." Torvin looked at Nora, and there was something in the old woman's eyes that was not just recognition. It was grief, and something on the other side of grief, something that looked like relief. "Aldrich Vance did not just hide you, child. He gave up everything to give you the chance to find your own way to this moment. He knew that the bond would find you when the time was right. He trusted that. The world rearranged itself around that information, the way worlds do when the foundational fact they have been built on turns out to have been a different fact entirely. Nora stood in the center of it and let it rearrange. Her father, who had died in a border battle when she was 4 years old, who she remembered in fragments of warmth and the smell of leather and wood smoke, and something green and growing. Her father, who had been called the greatest warrior the clan had ever produced, whose name she had carried like a question she did not know how to ask. Her father had known. He had looked at his daughter and known what she was, and he had made the choice that cost him everything, the choice to become ordinary, so that she could become extraordinary on her own terms, without a target painted on her back from the first day she drew breath. "He knew I had no wolf," she said. "He knew your wolf was sleeping," Torvin said. "He knew it would wake when the bond called it. He knew you were safe or unknown. He knew." She paused. "He asked me to watch over you when he understood he was running out of time. I have not been as present in that watching as I should have been. I am sorry." For that, Nora had nothing to say to that. She put it somewhere internal where she could return to it later, when she had more space for the weight of it. Right now the wolf was pressing against the inside of her skin, and the silver and gold light was doing something to the air around her, and 300 people were watching her process. The complete dissolution and reconstruction of her understanding of herself. And there was not room, in this particular moment, for grief to have the space it deserved. "This does not change the political reality," Saraphene said, and her voice had found its control again, the performance of composure assembled back into place with visible effort. She was looking at Caden, not at Nora. She understood, Nora recognized, that the strategic conversation was with him. Whatever her bloodline, the alliances that our union represents are real. The peace they maintain is real. "You would risk all of that for this?" "I would risk nothing," Caden said, and his voice was very quiet. "I have no choice in this. That is the nature of the bond selection. It is not a preference. It is not a political statement. It is a fact. And you know this. Everyone in this room knows this. The northern clans will not accept it. The northern clans," Torvin said, "are going to be presented with evidence of the founding bloodline, which their own traditions hold in higher regard than any political alliance currently in existence. You might be surprised, Lady Voss, by how quickly certain political realities rearrange themselves when something older and more fundamental asserts itself." Saraphene looked at Nora then, directly, for the first time since Nora had entered the chamber, and the look was complicated in a way that Nora had not expected. It was still hostile. It was still calculating. But underneath both of those things, Nora could see something that she recognized from having lived for 23 years, as the invisible person in rooms full of people. Who mattered? It was loneliness. Saraphene Voss, in the middle of all her beautiful, dangerous, expertly performed certainty, was profoundly alone. She had built her whole life on the promise of this particular future, and the future had just been taken from her, not by a rival she could fight on equal terms, but by something she had no framework for contesting. Nora did not feel sorry for her, but she noted the loneliness. She filed it away. "What happens now?" she said, and she was addressing, Torvin. But she was also, she realized, addressing everyone in the room, all 300 witnesses to a ceremony that had turned into something none of them had been prepared for. "Now," Torvin said, "you are acknowledged. By the bond, by the founding bloodline, by this chamber and everyone in it." The old woman looked out at the assembly, and her voice rose slightly, gaining the particular quality of formal declaration. "The bond has chosen. The blood has revealed itself. Let it be witnessed. And let it be recorded. Nora Vance, of the line of the first Alpha Queen, stands before this assembly in recognition of her birthright." The silence that followed that declaration was the third kind of silence Nora had experienced that evening. Not the silence of cruel amusement, not the silence of shock. This was the silence of acknowledgement, the silence of a room full of people absorbing the weight of something real. And then, from somewhere near the back of the chamber, someone began to lower themselves into the formal bow that the clan laws required when acknowledging those of royal blood. One person, then the person beside them, then the person beside that person. The bow moved through the chamber like a wave, slow and inevitable, spreading from the back toward the front. And Nora watched it come, and felt the wolf pressing against her skin, and felt the light that was her own light doing something in the air around her that she did not yet have the language for. And she stood. Straight, because whatever else she was or was not, whatever she understood or did not understand about this evening, she knew how to stand straight. She had been standing straight her whole life in rooms that did not want her there. She knew how to do that. When the bow reached Saraphene, the other woman stood for a long moment without moving, and then, with a precision and deliberateness that made it a statement rather than a concession, she bent from the waist, held it for exactly the minimum, required duration, and straightened again. It was not gracious. It was not kind. But it was done. And done was what mattered in this particular moment. Caden was the last one to bow. He had remained standing through the whole of it. And when everyone else had straightened, he stepped forward. And instead of the formal bow, he offered the deeper one, the one reserved for someone of greater rank. And when he straightened, he looked at her with those eyes that missed nothing and said, quietly, "I did. Not know. I need you to understand that. I looked through you for 3 years without knowing, and I am sorry for that. You are not required to apologize," she said. "I am aware of what I am required to do," he said. "This is something different." The bond moved between them, unhurried, and pressed its warm silver head briefly against first his hand, and then hers, and the light from both of them, his dark and steady and hers silver and gold, did something in the space between them that no one in the chamber missed, and that no historian would adequately describe for generations. The days that followed were not simple. Nora had not expected them to be simple. She had lived 23 years in a world that did not offer simple, and she had no particular reason to believe the world had changed its position on the matter. The council met twice daily. Messengers were dispatched to every allied clan, and a significant number of clans whose alliance was more theoretical than actual. The historians were, in fact, called, and they spent 18 consecutive hours in the castle library, emerging periodically to present documents and records and genealogical proofs that they delivered with the particular breathless energy of scholars who have just found the most important footnote of their careers. Saraphene Voss remained in the castle because leaving precipitously would have been a political statement she was not yet ready to make, and her presence moved through the corridors like weather, making every room colder when she entered it, and slightly warmer when she left. Her two companions had changed their behavior toward Nora with a speed that was almost impressive, shifting from invisible cruelty to visible deference in under 12 hours, which told Nora a great deal about where their loyalties had always actually resided. Maren said nothing about any of it. She continued to work in the kitchens as though the world had not tilted on its axis, except that she had moved. Nora's personal belongings from the small room near the bread ovens to a room on the third floor that had a window and a view of the mountains, and she had done it without discussion or announcement, simply as a thing that needed to be done, and had therefore been done. Nora loved her more for this than for anything else. The room Nora was given formally, by the household staff under the direction of the council, was on the 5th floor and had 3 windows and a fireplace, and a bed that was the largest she had ever been in, and she lay in it that first night unable to sleep, listening to the wolf move inside her like a tide, feeling the steady silver and gold light that came from her own skin in the dark and illuminated the ceiling with patterns she was only beginning to learn how to read. Caden came to the door of her study on the 3rd day, not the formal study that had been arranged for her by the council, with its desk and its bookshelves and its carefully selected pile of documents she was expected to review regarding the founding bloodline and its significance. He came to the small room she had taken for herself, a room that the household staff had identified as a sitting room of no particular importance, which meant that no particular importance would be attached to her choosing it for her private use. She had brought a chair from the formal study and a small table, and she spent her evenings there with the Bond, who had taken to sleeping across the threshold, like a guardian who had decided that its watching needed to be more literal than metaphorical. He knocked. She said, "Come in," and he came in, and the Bond raised its head from the threshold and looked at him with those ancient eyes that assessed rather than judged, and then laid its head back down, with the air of something that found the situation satisfactory. "You are avoiding the formal spaces," he said. "I am not avoiding them. I attend everything I am required to attend." "Everything you are required to attend," he repeated. "Not the meals that are not required. The meals that are not required involve Saraphene and a table full of people recalibrating their positions in relation to a political situation they do not yet fully understand," Nora said. "I find the recalibration difficult to observe with equanimity." He stood in the doorway, because she had not invited him to sit, and he understood, she thought, that she was still learning how to have the kind of power that entitled her to set the terms of interactions, the kind of power that did not need to be performed because it simply was, and that he was not going to rush that process. "May I sit?" he said. "Yes," she said. He sat in the chair across from her, and they were silent for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which surprised her, because she had expected all of her interactions with him to require the kind of careful management that interactions with powerful people had always required. He was still powerful. He was the Alpha King. But the power between them had changed in some way that she was still mapping, shifted into a different relationship than the one she had spent 3 years observing from the kitchen. The Bond's warmth came from the threshold and settled over the room like a second fire. "The Northern clan leaders are arriving in 12 days, he said. "I know. I have read the council reports. They will want to examine the genealogical record personally. They will want to speak with Torvin. Some of them will want to test the bloodline through their own methods, which are older and less comfortable than the libraries. I understand. They will also," he said, and his voice shifted slightly, "be evaluating whether you are prepared to stand as what the Bond's choice implies you are prepared to stand as." She looked at him. "You mean whether I am prepared to be queen?" "Yes." "And what do you think?" she asked. "You have been observing me for 3 days. You watched me in the ceremony. You have read the council's assessments of my behavior and my presentation and my management of the transition. What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not reach for the easy answer. did not produce the reassurance that would have been simple and empty and would have told her nothing. He was actually thinking about the question, and she watched him think about it and found, somewhat to her surprise, that watching him think was one of the more interesting things she had encountered in recent memory. "I think," he said at last, "that you have been preparing for this your entire life, without knowing that was what you were doing. I think the years of being invisible gave you something that years of being visible could not have given you. I think you understand things about the people in these corridors that I do not understand, because you watch them from a position they did not know was being watched. I think the bond knew something that I did not." He paused. "I think I have been asking the wrong question for the past 3 days. What is the right question? Not are you ready," he said, "but what do you need to be able to do what you were born to do?" The warmth in her chest was different from the warmth of the wolf, or perhaps it was related to it. She was still learning to distinguish the separate temperatures of the things that were waking up inside her. She looked at him across the small table in the small room with the bond, breathing softly at the threshold, and said, "I need time. I need to learn what I do not know. I need people around me who will tell me the truth about what they see even when the truth is not flattering. And I need to be able to work with you as a partner rather than as a subject, which I understand is not the traditional framework, but which I believe is the only framework I am actually capable of operating within." He looked at her for a long moment. And then, for the first time, he did something she had not previously seen him do. He smiled. Not the formal expression that performed warmth for audiences, a real one, unguarded, reaching his eyes, slightly off-center, like a smile that had surprised itself by arriving. "I was hoping you would say something like that," he said. "Were you?" "The traditional framework," he said, "has produced a number of outcomes that I have found increasingly difficult to justify. A different approach seems warranted." Saraphene made her move on the 9th day. Nora had not been surprised that she would make a move. She had been paying attention to the signs for the better part of a week. The small things. The way Saraphene's 2 companions had begun attending functions separately rather than together. The way certain members of the council with Northern clan connections had started showing up to meetings with an alertness that suggested they had been briefed on something that the rest of the council had not been told. The way the castle's head of household security had begun looking at Nora in rooms with too many exits, not with hostility, but with the focused attention of someone who was planning for contingencies. Nora had spent 3 years being invisible, which meant she had spent 3 years learning to read the room while appearing not to, and what she had read over the past 9 days was the architecture of a plan. She told Caden on the 8th day. He had listened to her with the same quality of real attention that she was learning to expect from him, which still surprised her slightly every time it arrived, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then said, "You are confident about this." "I am confident about the pattern," she said. "I cannot tell you what the specific action will be." "No," he agreed, "but the pattern is enough." He looked at her. "How long have you been reading rooms like this?" "Always," she said. "It is considerably easier when the room does not know you." "Are reading it." His expression did something complicated. "I owe you an apology that I do not think 3 days of formal acknowledgement adequately covers." "You do not owe me anything," she said, and she meant it, or was working toward meaning it, which was close enough for the purposes of the present conversation. "I disagree," he said simply, and did not push it further, which she found she respected. The move Saraphene made was through the Northern clan's secondary delegation, a group of 6 representatives who had arrived 3 days ahead of the main party and who had been given access to the castle's formal records on the grounds of being advanced researchers. What they had actually been doing with that access, it turned out, was searching for a specific document that Saraphene needed to make a legal argument that the founding bloodline's claim was invalid under a treaty clause from 4 generations ago. A clause that Saraphene had apparently spent the past 9 days uncovering. Through a combination of her own considerable research abilities, and the assistance of 2 historians who had been persuaded that their careers would benefit from cooperation. The security team found the document missing from the archive at the 6th hour. They found the delegation attempting to leave the castle grounds at the 7th hour. The document was recovered at the 8th hour, undamaged, which was fortunate, because the historians who were not cooperating with Saraphene had been working for 5 days on a separate project, one that Torvin had commissioned quietly, and which had produced, on the morning of the 9th day, a discovery that made Saraphene's treaty clause entirely irrelevant. The founding bloodline's claim, it turned out, superseded every treaty clause in the existing record by virtue of a provision written into the original compact of the 7 clans, a provision so old that most contemporary scholars had assumed it was ceremonial rather than functional, that specified that the choice of the bond was final, absolute, and not subject to any subsequent agreement made by any party for any reason. The provision had been written in the oldest form of the pack language, which fewer than a dozen living scholars could read, which was presumably why it had been overlooked for 3 generations. Torvin had found a scholar in the Southern Territories who could read it. The scholar had arrived the previous evening. The translation had been completed by dawn. When Caden presented the translation to the full council, with Saraphene's delegation present, the silence in the room was the specific silence of a plan meeting the wall of something it had not calculated for. Saraphene sat at the council table with her hands folded in her lap, and her face perfectly arranged, and said nothing for a long time. And then she said quietly, "You knew." "I did not know," Caden said. "But I was told to look." She turned her head and looked at Nora, who was sitting at the council table for the first time, in the chair that had been formally placed there 2 days ago, and that she had occupied at every meeting since, with the specific quality of someone who understood they were still learning, but had committed to the learning with their whole attention. Saraphene looked at her, and the calculation in her eyes was running through its final configurations, and Nora could see the exact moment when it reached its conclusion. "You told him to look," Saraphene said. "I told him there was a pattern," Nora said. He looked. Saraphene was quiet again. The room was quiet. The bond, which had taken to attending council meetings by virtue of simply being wherever Nora was, sat near the wall and radiated its patient light, and watched with those ancient eyes that assessed rather than judged. "What happens to me?" Saraphene said finally. And the question was so direct, so stripped of its usual architecture of performance and strategy, that it landed in the room with a weight that surprised everyone, including, Nora thought, Saraphene herself. "Nothing happens to you," Caden said. "You made a political calculation that did not succeed. That is the nature of political calculation. You will return to your own clan, with the official record noting that the arrangement between our families was dissolved by the determination of the bond and the revelation of the founding bloodline, both of which supersede previous agreements under the original compact. No fault is assigned. No consequences are enacted." Saraphene looked at him, then at Nora, then back at him. "That is more generous than I would have been," she said. "Yes," Caden agreed. Another silence, and then very quietly, Saraphene said something that no one in the room had expected, least of all, Nora. "I am sorry," she said, "for the years of it. I knew you worked in the kitchens. I was deliberate about it." Nora felt the wolf move in response to that, not with aggression, with something more complex. The recognition that an apology, when it is genuine, deserves a genuine response even when the thing being apologized for was considerable. "I know you were," she said, "and I know why. You were protecting what you believed was yours. I understand the impulse." She paused. "I accept the apology." Saraphene left the castle the following morning. Her departure was formal and correct in every procedural detail, and Nora stood at the top of the main stairs and watched. Her go without satisfaction and without resentment, which felt like an achievement she had not been certain she was capable of, until she found herself actually doing it. The Northern clan leaders arrived on the 12th day. The meeting that followed was not simple. It was, in fact, one of the most complex political negotiations that had been conducted in the 7 clans in 2 generations, and it lasted 4 days. And there were moments during those 4 days when Nora sat in the formal negotiating chamber and felt the wolf inside her and the light around her and the steady warmth of the bond near the door, and used every skill she had developed over 23 years of watching rooms without being watched, and the skills turned out to be substantial. She asked questions that the Northern leaders had not expected to be asked. She identified the distinction between what they said they wanted and what they actually needed with an accuracy that Breswick later described in a council meeting she was not attending as, frankly, unsettling. She remembered names and connected them to political positions and family histories, with a facility that made the historians present stare at each other. She made 2 proposals that solved 2 different problems that the Northern leaders had not known were related, and the connection she drew between them turned out to be the thing that moved the negotiation from 4 days to 3 days and produced a compact that Torvin declared was the most favorable Ashvale had received from the Northern territories in 60 years. On the evening of the 3rd day, after the Northern leaders had retired, Caden found her in the small sitting room that had become, by unspoken mutual agreement, the place where they were not the Alpha King and the heir to the founding bloodline, but simply 2 people who had found, somewhat unexpectedly, that they thought better in the same room than in separate ones. The bond was there. It was always there. It had, if anything, become more settled over the past 12 days, more comfortable, as though it had been carrying the work of waiting for a very long time and was now able to rest. Torvin thinks the Northern Compact will hold for 40 years, he said. Torvin is being conservative, Nora said. It will hold longer. The Greymount clan's 2nd representative, the younger one, made 3 proposals in the final session that all pointed in the same direction. They are not interested in conflict. They are interested in stability because they are planning a major internal restructuring, and they need the border quiet while they do it. A compact that gives them the stability they need will hold as long as the restructuring takes, which will be at least 50 years. He looked at her. How did you know about the restructuring? I did not know specifically, but the pattern of what they asked for and what they avoided telling us they needed was consistent with a group managing a significant internal change. I have seen the pattern before, in smaller form, in the kitchen, when Maren was planning a reorganization of the supply procedures, but did not want to announce it until she was certain it would succeed. She paused. The scales are different. The pattern is the same. He was quiet for a moment. The fire burned. The bond's light moved with it. I would like to tell you something, he said finally. All right. When the bond chose you, he said, my first response was political. I assessed the situation for what it meant for the alliance with Saraphene's clan, for what it meant for the Northern relationships, for what it would require in terms of management and communication and risk mitigation. That was my first response. I need you to know that. I know, she said. I would have been concerned if it had not been. My second response, he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, carrying less of the formal register and more of the quality she had come to. Associate with the moments when he was being entirely honest was something I did not have a name for and have not had a name for since. It is not political. It is not strategic. It is not something I can put in a council report or present to the Northern leaders as a factor in the compact. He looked at her across the small table in the small room with the fire burning between them. I think you know what it is. She did know what it was. She had known for days. She had been moving toward. Acknowledging it the way you move toward a light in a dark room, slowly, checking each step, not because you are afraid of the light, but because you have lived a long time in the dark and your eyes need time to adjust. The bond did not just wake my wolf, she said. It woke everything else, too. Yes, he said. And you feel it, she said. The mate bond. I have felt it since the ceremony. he said. "Since before the ceremony, if I am being precise. In the kitchen corridor, when you said I know why, and I believed you. And I realized that I was looking at someone who understood something about power, that I had been standing too close to the center of to be able to see clearly." She looked at him for a long moment, and the wolf moved in her, not with urgency, but with certainty. And the light that was her own light did something warm and specific in the air between them. And she thought about her father, who had given up everything so that she could arrive here on her own terms, fully herself, not defined by the expectations of others, but discovered through the experience of her own life. And she thought he would have understood this moment, this precise moment, this quiet room, and this honest man, and this ancient creature resting peacefully at the threshold, as though it had been waiting for this specific evening for its entire long existence. "What do you want?" she said, not asking what was politically required or ceremonially appropriate. "What do you want?" "I want the same thing the bond wants," he said, "which is the same thing I think you want, if you are willing to say it." "I have been invisible for 23 years, she said. "I have become extremely comfortable with saying things that no one is expecting." "Then say it," he said. "I want this," she said. "You. This room. This work. The Northern Compact that will hold for 50 years, and the council meetings where we think better together than separately, and the wolf that has been asleep my whole life and is awake now, and the founding bloodline, and all of its complicated implications, and Marin's cooking, and the mountains outside my window, and the bond sleeping at the threshold." She paused. "I want all of it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached across the small table and put his hand over hers, and the warmth that moved between them was not just the warmth of the fire, or the warmth of the wolf, or the warmth of the bond's patient light. It was something that belonged to both of them together, something that was larger than either of them alone, something that had been waiting in the space between them for all the time that they had been moving toward each other without knowing that was what they were doing. "Yes," he said. The formal ceremony of recognition was held 3 weeks later. Nora had been involved in planning it, which she had found both instructive and occasionally overwhelming, because ceremonies were, it turned out, extremely complicated pieces of political theater with 1,000 details that each carried specific significance to one or more of the parties observing them, and getting them right required the same kind of pattern reading she had been applying to everything else, but with considerably more people watching and considerably higher stakes. Torvin had been invaluable. Breswick had been enthusiastic in ways that were sometimes helpful, and sometimes simply loud. The historians had produced a document tracing the founding bloodline's history that was simultaneously academically rigorous and emotionally devastating, which Nora had read in her small sitting room with the bond beside her, and wept over in private before presenting a composed face to the council. Marin had made the ceremonial dishes. When Nora had gone to the kitchen to ask her, Marin had looked at her for a long moment with the particular look of someone who has been waiting a long time for a conversation to become possible. And then she had said, "Your father would be proud." And those were the most words she had ever said to Nora at one time. And Nora had stood in the kitchen where she had spent 3 years of her life, and felt the wolf and the light and the grief and the gratitude and the strange, specific joy of having become, finally, fully herself. "Thank you," Nora had said. "The ceremonial bowls will need to be ready before the 3rd bell," Marin had replied, which meant exactly what it had always meant, which was everything. The ceremony was held in the Great Hall, with all 7 clan delegations present, with the northern leaders occupying the seats of honor that the new compact had formalized, with Torvin at the head of the council, and Breswick somewhere in the back being his particular volume of enthusiastic, with 300 people who had been in the chamber on the first night, and several hundred more who had not been. The bond walked beside Nora as she entered, and the light she carried, silver and gold, the light of the founding bloodline, moved with every step she took and filled the hall with something that was not just illumination, but presence. The particular presence of something that had been lost for 4 generations and was now, simply, here. Caden was waiting at the center of the hall. He was wearing the formal regalia of the Alpha King, which she had seen him in for ceremonies before, from a distance, from the invisible position, and he looked exactly as he had always looked in it. Powerful and composed, and carrying the specific weight of leadership with the ease of someone who has learned to make the weight invisible. But he was looking at her as she walked toward him, and his expression was not the formal composure of ceremony. It was the real one, the unguarded one, the one that had surprised itself by arriving, the first time she had seen it, in a small room with a fire burning and the bond at the threshold. She walked to the center of the hall and stood beside him and turned to face the assembly. Torvin's voice filled the hall with the declaration of the founding bloodline, the genealogical proof, the compact provisions, the translation of the original agreement. The northern leaders were watching with the attentiveness of people who had committed to a course and were confirming that the foundation it rested on was solid. The council members had the expressions of people who had managed a difficult situation and were beginning to see the outline of what it had been managing toward. The historians were taking notes, and somewhere at the back of the hall, Nora saw Marin, who had brought a cloth to a basin of cold water when Nora had needed it most, who had moved her belongings to a room with a window, who had made the ceremonial dishes and said your father would be proud, and returned immediately to practicality, because that was how kindness worked when you had learned it from the ground up. Marin was standing at the back of the hall with her, hands folded in front of her and her head slightly raised, and she was watching Nora with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a very long time to see something, and is seeing it now, and finds that it is exactly as it should be. When Torvin's declaration was complete, the hall went silent for one long moment. And then, beginning at the back and moving forward, slowly, inevitably, the 7 clans bowed. Nora stood straight. She had always stood straight. She had learned it in rooms that did not want her there, practicing in dignity that was not yet recognized, carrying a name whose meaning she did not yet understand, being the daughter of a man who had given up everything so that she could find her own way to this moment. She stood straight, and she let the light that was her own light fill the hall, and she felt the wolf, full and warm and awake at last, and she felt Caden's hand find hers in the space between them, and she felt the bond's warmth behind her like a fire that had been burning since before she was born, and would continue after everything she knew had turned to ash, patient and ancient, and entirely certain that it had always been waiting for exactly this. She had been invisible for 23 years. She was no longer invisible. And in that hall, with those 300 witnesses, and the Northern Compact, and the founding bloodline, and the man beside her who thought better in the same room as her than in separate ones, and the ancient creature at her back whose choice could not be bought or corrupted or convinced to reconsider, Nora Vance finally understood what her father had understood when he had looked at his daughter and seen what she would become. He had known that the waiting would be long. He had known it would be hard. He had known that she would be made invisible before she could be made visible, that she would learn herself in the dark before she could stand in the light. And he had trusted, with the specific faith of a man, who understood both the nature of love and the nature of destiny, that the light would come. He had been right. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?